Hey guys, it's Robin, RsIslandCrafts, and welcome to my craft room. In one of my recent videos, I showed you how I now mail my fabric postcards. And then if you purchase one from my shop, and by the way, I am working on them this week, so they're going to be going into the shop very soon, how I supply you with your clear envelope and your adhesive shipping label. Now, after posting that video, I realized that I've changed how I make my fabric postcards a little bit. So I thought I'd go ahead and give you an updated video just to show you some of the different things that I've changed. The way I did them in the old video will work out perfectly fine, but this is just a bit of an update that I find a little bit easier for myself. Now, based on the way that I learned it back then, I learned that you can use this, it's a stiff felt product. There's no glue or adhesive, it's not shiny, it's just a stiff felt. And there's also some other products that for different things for sewing and bag making and stuff that are a little bit thick too. You want a little bit of a stiffness to your fabric postcard, and I was using this as the base to stitch everything on. So now I just use my cotton batting that I love so much. I just use that as basically as my platform to sew things on, whether it's a quilt as you go or I make a picture or a block and then put it on top of the batting. And I just use that in place of this stiff felt. You can still use stiff felt, regular felt. You can use any type of batting. I just like the cotton. I actually made this one using some cotton batting that I was sent to try out. This is batting that was left from when you put a quilt on a long arm and you have that extra strips along either side. So I was testing that out. I did Franken piece my batting. You can see that little seam going up this, well, not the center, but you see that seam going up here. It's because the pieces that I needed, I want them to be cut 5 by 7. My finished postcard is going to be 4.5 by 6.5. So I like to make sure I have a little bit extra batting so that as anything might shrink up or anything like that, I have plenty of room to work on it. You can make it any size you want. But for me, I'm going to go down to a 4.5 by 6.5 postcard. So I want it to be just a little bit larger than that. Basically, this is just a surface for me to work off of. It is what's going to be on the inside of my postcard. So whatever you want to use to get you to that final point, go ahead and use it. You can use felt. I have, as I said, I've got the cotton batting. You can use polyester. I've got wool. You can use bamboo. It's just a great way to use up scraps. This piece just happens to be a whole piece, but normally mine are all Franken pieced. I tend to have a lot of 1.5, 2-inch strips, and I just go ahead and stitch them all together. When my batting scraps start to get out of control, I just go ahead and make a whole bunch of Franken pieces like this, and I make them about the 5 to 7. Some of them are maybe 6 to 9, and some of them are a little bit wonky, but then I just go ahead and trim them up as I need them. I just go ahead and make a big stack of them so that when I'm ready to make fabric postcards, I have that already prepared, and I can just go ahead and start making them. Now for my backs, I have used cardstock in the past, but right now what I'm using is this is a comic book board. Many of you may remember these and may still use them now. A lot of people like to wrap their fabric around them and then store it on their shelves, like you would see when you go to your fabric store and how they have them on the bolts like this. So they're just taking whatever fabric that they have and wrapping around it. I purchased a pack of 100 of these and tried that myself, and I wasn't happy with how it sat on my shelf. It didn't work for me. I'm going to put up an iCard for how I now fold my fabric and put it up on the shelves. So I've been actually using this. I've been cutting it down to the size that I need, my 4.5 by 6.5, and this is just really, it's not to where you can't bend it, but it is nice and sturdy that it works really well in combination of everything on my fabric postcard. It allows it to go through the machines at the post office, and it still bends a little, so it's not super stiff, but at the same time, it's sturdy enough to hold everything together and things don't get folded or ripped and torn. At least so far, I haven't heard any complaints about any of the ones I've sent out. Now, I've been making some scrappy ones like this. I've been using the fabric salvages. I have a couple more ideas that I'm going to be working on. I kind of do a bunch of one type and then I move on to the next type. So I might make 20 or 30 of the salvage ones and then I'll move on to the scrappy ones. This is really fun to, also you can include it with, like, after you've made a quilt or something, you can go ahead and include this in with your quilt, using up those last bits of scraps that are left over. But let me show you how I do this. So I have my piece of batting. It is cut out a 1/2 inch larger all the way around, so it's 5 by 7. I have a little bucket here of some scraps. They're about 1 1/4 inch wide. They're different lengths, but I also have a little pile of the shorter ones because when you're doing it on the diagonal, you're going to start with your longest piece and eventually you're going to go to the shortest one, right? So just like I've shown you in many other different types of blocks, I just lay it down across the center. You can pin it if you want, but when I cut it out, I kind of move my ruler around to straighten it, everything up so it looks good. Then I just go ahead and I grab my next piece. As you can see, I have a wider piece here in the center and a narrower piece there. That's just how it happened to work out. It is extra long. You can trim it now, you can trim it later, but if you trim it early, you just want to make sure when you fold it over that it's going to cover your entire piece of batting or whatever surface you're using there. I just stick with my 1/4 inch seam and I leave it at the 2.0. This is really, I mean, it's a fabric postcard. You want it to stay together, of course, but at the same time, you don't need to go super tight and super crazy. If your 1/4 inch isn't exact and your postcard comes a little bit wonky, it's going to be fine. Now, since I'm using cotton batting and there's no type of scrim or any type of glue or anything in there, so both sides are perfectly, it's all 100% cotton batting that's been needle felted together, I can take this over to my iron if I want, and I can give it a good press, but just doing it with my fingers works perfectly fine. This is just a single unit of a postcard. It doesn't need to match up with anything else. So if I get a little bit of extra fabric where I didn't press the seam all the way over, it's going to be okay because I'm going to give the last bit of it a good press with a nice hot steamy iron. It's going to make everything lay flat and it'll be okay. So then I just randomly stick my hand back into the bin and pull out something else, right sides together. My first piece was right sides up. I always forget to mention that part. This is just like making a string block, but we're working on a rectangle. So I'm going to go ahead and continue stitching and flipping and finger pressing until I get to the end. And I'm going to spin it around and I'm going to start at this side and I'm going to do the same exact thing. And I'll show you what it looks like when it's complete. Now, just like string blocks, it's nice if you have a large piece of a triangle or something or a square that you can cut in half to put at this end here so you're not having to worry about using all the strings and you're not going to have any weird pieces cut off when you trim everything up. But since it's just a fabric postcard, I'm not going to worry about it too much. As long as it's close enough to the corner, I'm going to leave it as B. I might use a little bit thinner. Maybe I'll go down to 1/8 of an inch on my seam allowance. I just know that when I'm trimming this corner that I have a little bit sticking out here, about 1/4 of an inch, and maybe a little bit more towards 1/2 an inch sticking out on that end. And I've also just stitched that fabric down. Yep, the wrong way. Now this one, I could just leave it, but I kind of like the fabric that's on the other side in the books. So I'm going to go ahead and unstitch this. I know some of you are going to be totally shocked that I tend to just leave things in. But this was the very last one. If it was more in the center, I would have left it. But I'm catching this right away, and it's right at the end. I'm just going to go ahead, fix it up a little bit to make it a little better so that I can have right sides together so I can get that little book that might show up there. There. Now, when I press it over, I might be able to get that book that'll sit into my postcard. So now everything's all kind of loosey-goosey and flippy-floppy and all poofy and stuff here. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a good press. I love to use steam in my iron, so I am going to steam this up because I know my cotton batting is going to be able to handle it. So I don't have to worry about any of that. It's also going to help everything lay nice and flat. And there we go. So see, everything was a little bit high up and poofy, so if I had any of my seams that weren't just quite right, I've gone ahead and pressed them to death. Everything's good. You can iron, you can press. These aren't going to go anywhere except for the 2 loose ones at the end. So you go ahead and just hit it really good. And as I said, with the cotton batting, it's no problem. I'm going to flip this over and trim it so I can show you what it looks like. So I was able to get that little book in there, and I do just have a little piece of fabric here, and I'm not going to worry about that because I'm not going to have a seam allowance where I'm stitching this to other quilt blocks or anything where I'm going to lose those corners. So if I have just a little bit there, I'm not going to worry about it. Now this comic book board, it goes in when you have the plastic sleeves like this for your comic books to protect them, you go ahead and put this board in it so that you can sit them all up in like one of their boxes or however they store them, or on the shelf like we do our fabric, and it makes it stand up nice and sturdy. It doesn't make it, the comic book won't bend or get any creases that way. But it has a dull side and a shiny side. And in my personal thoughts, I mean, you do it however you want, but I feel like the shiny side is a little bit harder to write on, that the dull side would be easier for people to write on, and the ink wouldn't smear as much as it does on the glossy side. So when I take this is it, I'm all done. I take this and I put the glossy side down, and that's the end of it for my postcards. Before I stitch on my border to hold these pieces together, I go ahead and just use the little clips. Now, if you want, you can go ahead and put some heat and bond or other type of fusible, press it onto the back of your batting, and you can iron it right onto that cardboard. Or if you choose to use fabric instead, you can iron it onto that. So we make sure this is nice and even. It's not a crisis if your board and your fabric postcard aren't even and there might be a little bit of something sticking out, but I do try to make it as even as I can. Things do shift while you're sewing, so if that bothers you, that's why it's a good way to use some heat and bond or something like that. And then you can put any type of a border stitch you want around it. You can put some binding. I prefer not to do binding on the fabric postcards. I don't like to do binding through the cardboard. So it definitely becomes a machine binding unless you want to bring it to the front and hand stitch it to here. So that's something I don't really like to mess with, but I will do it on a mug rug. If you're making it something similar like that, I'll do it on a mug rug because that's just all fabric. But I don't like to do the satin stitch either. I've just never been a fan of how that just piles up the thread. It does use a lot of thread. The one that I use, the design I choose, it also uses up a lot of thread. So my machine has this fancy stitch. It's kind of like a feather stitch that I use. It is not as noticeable. It's kind of hard to see on the back because as you're stitching through a cardboard, it changes how your machine is going to stitch it. But I like how I can have it overlap on the edge so it keeps everything all in nice here. You are still going to get a little bit of fraying here and there on your fabric, especially if you have a fabric that frays a lot. By the way, thank you so much. This fabric was sent by one of you guys for me to play with, so I thought I had someone in mind for this card, and I thought it just might be nice. For some reason, I feel like they would enjoy this type of fabric postcard, so I used it with just one piece of fabric. I didn't piece anything. I just quilted it on the diagonal for some texture because I used the wool batting, and that is really some poofy stuff. So can you see how thick the wool batting is? So it's kind of like polyester where it has a lot of, you know, poof to it, but once you start stitching down on it, it compresses it. And definitely once I hit it with the iron, it compressed it a lot. So there is that. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set my machine to just so, and as I'm going to stitch, I want to make sure one of the threads overlaps on here. So whatever stitch you want to use, anything you want to go ahead and just use a satin stitch all the way around it, or a zigzag if your machine doesn't have it. You can even straight stitch just to hold these three. Well, I say three pieces because it's the fabric and the batting, but really it's just two pieces now. So you can just use a straight stitch. Just go to, like you're going to top stitch it about 1/8 of an inch all the way around, and that's going to hold everything together, and it's going to work out perfectly fine. I've done that with several postcards, and it is okay. So I just go ahead and set up my machine. I like to bring my thread to the front as always so I don't have any weird bird's nest on the back. And I just stitch around. It does eat up a bit of thread, So I have an abundance of white thread, so that's what I'm using. Plus I figured it blends in nicely with the back of the card. This one I didn't mind because I wanted the red for the frame of the little campers here and stuff like that with the red background, and I thought it worked out really nice with the red on the back. So if you want to have, I could have put red on the front and white on the back, but I wanted that little border this time. So depending on, maybe if you're doing Christmas or Halloween or Easter, you can use a different color thread to just go ahead and do that, or use some of your variegated. So while we're all stuck at home right now, it might be a nice idea to go ahead and make some fabric postcards and send them out to your friends and family to let them know that you're thinking of them, that everything is held together. Now the only thing left that I do is I find the halfway mark, which is 3 1/4. I like to draw a line. I don't draw over my thread. I mean, I could put this on ahead of time, but I just never think about it. And then I sign my postcards. I just go with my RsIslandCrafts. And this one's going to be going out in the mail soon, so I'm going to go ahead and just put the year 2020. You can write a nice little note to your friends and send them out to them. Let them know you're thinking of them. Use it as a birthday card. If you can't get to the store right now to pick up a birthday card, this is a fun way to make it, and this is something they can keep for a while. For those of you that are making masks, this is a good use for that scrap fabric that you might have left over to go ahead and just make some fun little fabric postcards. Even if you don't send them out right now, you can use them throughout the year so that you'll already have something ready whenever you want to send someone a little hello, how you doing? So that's all set to go. I'm going to go ahead and put links up in the iCard for the video where I showed on how I mail these, and also the original playlist on how to make fabric postcards. I would just pop this in here. I would seal it up, add my address label, put a stamp on it, and away it goes. But that's how I'm now making my fabric postcards. I find that I can just whip them out really quick when I'm making these scrappy ones, especially if I'm making them with the strips of fabric or with the selvages right now, that I can just go ahead and boom, 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 right after the other. I can get a lot of them done in a short amount of time. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and leave them down in the comments. I hope this helped explain a couple of the things that I've had questions about and how I've changed up how I make my fabric postcards. Thanks for hanging out with me in the craft room, and remember, create with scraptitude, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!